Our guest in the studio is CEO of Amnesty International, Colm O'Gorman. Colm, good afternoon to you.
Hi, Sean.
Now, there's kind of a sort of a macabre death watch thing almost for Mandela at this stage of the game, though. The last reports were his health seems to have improved slightly. Do you think, I mean, apart from the fact that obviously, it's pointing out the obvious about what a great statesman and world figure he's been, the effect on South Africa after he dies? I wonder, even though he's retired, has he still had a kind of a stabilising effect on South Africa? And when he goes, it might become a little bit more fractious.
Well, I'm no expert on the internal politics of South Africa, but it has struck me over the last couple of years that, as you often see post-independence, the most powerful party that emerges from that, and I mean really effectively post-apartheid, the ANC was the political party, the only political party in South Africa, starts to divide along different lines, and we've seen that over the last couple of years, and that's something that was likely to happen whether or not Mandela was around to somehow influence that. The thing that struck me most about it is it says something about the man himself, that most of the world now are in that place that many of us will recognise from our own families, where we're in this awful phase of watching and waiting as somebody lives out the final days of their lives. And that's a terribly I was going to say uncomfortable, but it's not necessarily when you're in it, I don't think, for those of us who've been through that. But it's a very intense disorientating kind of space that requires you to step out of the world for a period of time, and there's that expectation, that waiting for something awful to happen, whilst at the same time wanting desperately to support the individual and the rest of the family through what is a very distressing time. It seems to me that the world is kind of going through that in a way for Nelson Mandela at the moment, and I think that says an awful lot about who he is. When I was thinking about it during the week, like many other people, we've been thinking about, well, what do we say? What does anybody say when we lose somebody like Mandela? Yeah. And what struck me more than anything else is almost how unthinkable it is that he wouldn't be there. He's that much of an icon. He's had that much of an influence on the world over the last 40 or 50 years, but certainly over the last 30 years in particular, that it's unthinkable to imagine that he won't be there. So I think in many ways that just reminds me of almost waiting when my own father was dying, of waiting for him to die, trying to imagine what it would be like for him not to be in the world, struggling to get through that period with as much grace and love as possible, whilst at the same time watching this unfold. And now we're all doing that outside of what's a very intimate space for a family in a different way globally. It's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. And I suppose the odd thing about him is that when all the when he does pass away and when all the tributes start and all the rest of it, he seems, unless something terrible comes out about Nelson Mandela, which somehow I have a doubt about, given that he was incarcerated for such a long period of time, so what could he have done? That he's one of the few world figures who seem to be pretty much untainted by anything bad. I mean, you could perhaps argue that in the ANC, and that there was an armed struggle element to what they did before he went to prison and while he was in prison, but
I think one of the questions that will come up, and one of the topics for discussion that will emerge if and when Mandela finally does die, is that whole question of, up until the 1980s, he was globally seen as a terrorist. I mean, Margaret Thatcher once, for instance, when the concert, the seminal concert, we all remember that special song, Free Nelson Mandela, when that was performed for the first time in the 1980s and the BBC broadcast it, she asked why was the public broadcaster showcasing a tribute to a terrorist? And that's how he was seen at the time. And actually,
that's what the point of that concert was, actually, to get the word terrorist off his CV.
Equally, Amnesty International awarded Nelson Mandela the highest accolade we can, our Ambassador of Conscience Award. It was given to Aung San Suu Kyi here in Dublin last year, but we awarded to Nelson Mandela in 2006. And yet at the same time, we weren't able to adopt, because of our own internal rules, Mandela as a prisoner of conscience during the time that he was incarcerated, because those rules dictate that we can't adopt people as prisoners of conscience, which is a very specific definition, who in any way support violent struggle or armed struggle. And of course, and many people might feel that was entirely justified. Mandela supported the concept of armed struggle to overthrow apartheid rule. Many people might feel that was absolutely justified, but it meant that for Amnesty at that stage, that was a challenge that meant that whilst we could campaign against human rights violations in South Africa, including campaigning against the imprisonment of political prisoners like Nelson Mandela, we couldn't at that stage name him as a prisoner of conscience. So it's not that he's not uncontroversial. I think he's exceptionally, I'm going to use a double metaphor now, but he is remarkable. He's an extraordinary figure who transitioned from, political struggle through the concept of violent struggle and beyond, and supported the emergence of a state that's still struggling. I mean, South Africa is still a country that, we saw that last year, for instance, with the police responses to miners' strikes. South Africa is a country with many deep-seated problems and with major human rights problems as well. But it's a country in sub-Saharan Africa that post-independence has shown extraordinary resilience and a capacity to build strong institutions that are working towards really a very just and equal society. It's a way off, but I think that's part of his legacy.
Is that a tricky thing in the human rights arena, or the struggle for human rights for people, where perhaps occasionally, as in an apartheid South Africa situation, you could argue that you do need an armed struggle, that an armed struggle works, and that if it hadn't been for an armed struggle, you still might have an apartheid South Africa? Well,
the bottom line is violence is pervasive across the world, whether it's violence in the concept of an armed struggle or whether it's violence in the concept of armed conflict, what the law might define as legitimate armed conflict. So international human rights law and international law provides rules by which conflict has to be carried out. So the Geneva Conventions and other, it's one of those things that people sometimes struggle when they think that an organisation like Amnesty, for instance, might be perceived as an anti-war organisation. We're a human rights organisation, and human rights law provides for strict rules governing conflict. Yes, and it's a challenging area. We have to live, and human rights law and the human rights framework has to be able to live and operate in the real world. And that's why, for instance, if you look at what's happening in Egypt at the moment, I've just been watching on breaking news, we've just seen that 4 ministers have resigned from President Morsi's cabinet, but that the Muslim Brotherhood, his political grouping, is saying it's considering setting up self-defence units. Now, there's a country that's now in the midst of or heading into what looks like it might be, again, very considerable conflict. And what needs to happen there is, first of all, the state needs to uphold the right to peaceful protest, to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. And to do that, it can't be doing what it's been doing over the last couple of days, which is issuing these statements that suggest that those who might participate in protest are committing acts of thuggery, and encouraging, the public prosecutor there just last week encouraged private citizens to detain, arrest and hand over protesters who it believed might be responsible for some acts of thuggery. And that led to scores of people being held by civilians, beaten, mistreated and then handed over to the prosecutors. And now you have the ruling party effectively in Egypt saying that they're going to set up self-defence units. Responsibility for the rule of law rests with the state and the organs of the state, in this context the police and security forces. And the police and security forces must be impartial and objective in how they apply the rule of law. They must uphold the right to freedom of assembly and to peaceful protest. And they must protect people, including the Muslim Brotherhood, from attacks that might be violent or that might cause injury to them. Unfortunately, what we've seen in Egypt has been a real failure of the police and security forces, either under Mubarak or now indeed under Morsi, to be held to account for any violations that they've committed, or indeed to carry out policing and security in a way that respects the human rights of people living in Egypt. We don't have that at the moment.
No, we don't. But I suppose the difficulty in Egypt, though, is that they're a year and a bit in to being anything like a functioning democracy, and probably nobody knows how it's supposed to work. And there are so many probably aspects to having a functioning democracy, such as having a transparent security service, that they haven't even considered those things. And Morsi himself, what does he say? He was an engineer or something. They simply don't have enough experience.
Egypt is a pretty sophisticated society and has a significantly educated citizenship. It's not some,
for the culture of these things to bed down.
I've spoken to Egyptian activists and others, and many have spent time outside of Egypt, and many have worked within Egypt, and there are strong forces within Egypt really now that are working towards as fully functional a democracy as we can have. And Egypt is signatory to many of the global international human rights treaties. None of this stuff is, it's not rocket science. The police have to objectively apply the rule of law, and the rule of law must respect all people equally and must uphold rights like freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the right to participate in peaceful protest, etc. That's not rocket science. And the state can't act outside of the law. It must comply with the law. These are pretty clear principles. And Egypt, as I say, is a relatively sophisticated society and economy. And its legal system, there's lots of support available to Egypt if it wants to build those institutions, and that's what it needs to do.
Could it be at the moment Egypt, one gets the impression that in Egypt they're not quite sure what they want?
Well, there are differing views. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood did particularly well in the last round of presidential elections, but it wasn't by any means the overwhelming win that people expected. And we've now seen Rebel, who are the main opposition grouping, this umbrella grouping, are saying that they've collected 22 million signatories calling for Morsi's resignation. 22 million is a quarter of the population, and it's across the spread. I mean, you have both liberal and secularists, but also Muslim groupings, because they see that the suggestion is that Morsi and his government have failed to uphold security, to improve the economy, to really transition Europe from the Mubarak era into a more open and transparent society. So there's widespread discontent with Morsi, but certainly, generally speaking, both the liberals and secularists have been unhappy with both his election victory, but that's the nature of democracy, but also perhaps how he's brought certain people into the centre, and how he seems to be moving the state more and more, as they would see it, to an Islamist state where their freedoms and rights aren't fully respected, and that's why we're seeing the scale of protests that we're seeing. Yeah,
but I think, as you say, there are other issues there at play as well, like such as the economy.
And such as the economy and security, absolutely. The same issues that we face in many other parts of the world. I mean, look at what's happening in Rio over the last couple of weeks, or what was happening in Turkey a couple of weeks ago as well, and is still rumbling on in Turkey in various ways. I mean, people around the world are more and more inclined to mobilise when they see their governments act in ways that they can't see as being in their interests at all.
Right, we do have to take a commercial break. We'll chat more with Colm after this.
Moncrieff on News Talk 106 to 108.
1890 453 106 is our low call number. Our text number is 53106. That will cost you 30 cents. Colm O'Gorman from Amnesty International is still with us. We've been talking obviously about Nelson Mandela, who hasn't died yet, obviously, but there's a kind of a slightly macabre, I suppose, watch over him at the moment. Anyone else think it's ironic that Thatcher called Mandela a terrorist and then compared the global reaction to her passing and his illness? Well, obviously there were divided opinions about Margaret Thatcher. It will be my one big regret that I never got to meet Mandela. I cannot imagine South Africa without him, says another texter. Someone else, though, says white South Africans have every reason to be concerned. The number of murders on whites in remote places borders on genocidal. And that's whilst Mandela is alive and people are restrained out of respect. Now, I don't know about the genocidal part, but it certainly has been reported before that there is a little bit of concern amongst the white community about what the reaction might be.
I think it depends on what you mean by the white community. I mean, I know many white South Africans who wouldn't see themselves as part of a white community that feels at any moment now it's about to be set upon by the black majority. Quite the opposite. I saw I can't remember the name of it now, but I saw a fascinating documentary about 2 months ago about an Afrikaners only town that's been established, for instance, in the middle of South Africa. I can't for the life of me remember what it was called. So that culture is certainly seeking to find ways to continue to express itself and doesn't seem to be under particular attack. And I mean, I do think words like genocide are wildly out of proportion here. I've seen no evidence of any orchestrated, and we certainly see no evidence of any orchestrated violence against a white population in South Africa. I've no doubt about the fact that racist crime is a problem in South Africa, as it is in many parts of the world. In that context, it may well be that white South Africans are facing some level of racist violence, but then so also are black South Africans, so also are black Africans who've sought protection in South Africa from other parts of Africa because of conflicts there. Unfortunately, racism is a sad reality of human life at the moment.
Speaking of, Irish anti-immigrant attitudes are growing, apparently, according to that's new report.
Concerning, isn't it? I mean, we saw a report from the Immigrant Council of Ireland saying that they've seen a 5-fold increase in the number of serious racist incidents in the first 10 weeks in the first 10 weeks of the year, or the first 10 weeks since they launched a major awareness campaign. They were saying that they were logging 1 serious incident a week, and they're now logging 5 serious incidents a week, and that's on top of another report last week that suggested that Irish attitudes to immigrants are becoming much more negative. And I mean, when we say much more negative, we've seen almost a 4-fold increase in negative attitudes against immigrants from poor non-EU countries. In 2002, just 6% of Irish nationals said that no immigrants from those countries should be allowed, and in 2010, 22% said that none should be allowed into Ireland. And in the context of migrants or immigrants from those countries, really we're talking about people who come to Ireland seeking protection. So, because the general routes into, unless indeed there's an economic route for migration into Ireland, if we're seeking to recruit and people are able to get residency in Ireland for economic reasons because of taking up a particular job, for instance, in Ireland, generally speaking, most non-EU poor migrants are coming to Ireland seeking protection and fleeing conflict. I mean, in that situation, what's really worrying is, because of how our asylum system still works, for instance, we don't yet have a single protection procedure, a really effective, timely process that can assess people's application for protection, be it asylum or refugee status, and do it within a timely fashion. We don't have that yet. So very often people come to Ireland seeking asylum and they can be 6 years in the system before they get a decision. And generally speaking, that means 6 years in a system called direct provision, which would be fine if they were there for a number of months, but over a 6-year period has an appalling impact on them and their families' lives and health and mental health. And at the end of that process, they may, and by the way, during those 6 years, they're not allowed work.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's also a major issue. But, the reality is in times of crisis and in times of fear, people's attitudes harden. People are inclined to turn on others when they feel frightened. What I would like to see is some kind of political leadership that begins to address this issue and name some of these issues so that we don't... It would be awful if we saw attitudes towards migrants and people seeking protection in Ireland harden to the levels that we've seen in some other parts of the EU. I mean, we're now almost at the level of the UK, for instance. I'd hate to see that happen, because traditionally we've had a strong affinity with the idea that we might need to grant protection to people who are fleeing persecution or human rights violations in their own states. It'd be horrible to see that degraded in the face of this economic crisis, particularly when there's no reason for it. I mean, the 5,000 people who might be granted a residency here in Ireland this year or over the last number of years, the 34 or so thousand who've been granted it over the last 10 years, I think, or something like that, they didn't cause the economic crisis.
No,
listen to the Anglo tapes.
And
they had nothing to do with that. Do you know what I mean?
And it's worth pointing out, how small a number that is.
Yeah,
even compared
number.
to like people emigrating from other parts of the EU, it's a tiny number. And those are people seeking protection. Now, some of those cases may not be valid cases, but to assess that, and undoubtedly some won't be, and to assess that, the state has to put in place an effective, timely system that does it. We should be able to assess an application for asylum not in a number of years, but in less than a year. The government has set a target of about 6 months, but it's been that's the target for years. And yet we have people living in direct provision, living in single rooms, not able to cook or provide for themselves, eating what's put in front of them, living lives where all they can do is sleep, think and wait for years and years on end. We have children growing up in direct provision because of the failure to put in place a single protection procedure that assesses whether or not they should be granted residency in a timely way. Yeah, one imagines it's kind of gone off the political agenda somewhat
absolutely.
at the moment. Now, you're the head of a human rights organisation, or the Irish section of a human rights organisation. Lucinda Creighton says that abortion is a human rights issue. Does Amnesty have a position on abortion?
It does indeed, and Ms Creighton is right. Abortion is a human rights issue, but not from the direction that she's coming from, I would imagine. I mean, the reality is, and sometimes it's very hard to talk about an issue like abortion because it's such a complex and emotive, for completely understandable reason, a motive issue. But let's name some bald facts, because we're talking about law here. International human rights law, the body of law that governs human rights globally, does not provide for a right to life for the unborn. So on that basis, whilst people might argue that it should, it doesn't. So it doesn't provide protection for the unborn. However, what it does provide for is protection for the life of women. What it does provide for is rights to access, for instance, health services, essential healthcare services. The legislation that's been proposed in Ireland at the moment seeks to address both the X-case decision from 20 years ago and the European Court ruling recently on access to abortion. What it won't do is make Ireland compliant with international human rights law, because it won't address issues like, for instance, women who find that their pregnancies, that they're carrying fetuses or babies with fatal fetal abnormalities, completely untenable pregnancies, unviable pregnancies, where there's only one possible outcome. It won't address that appalling issue at all. We'll continue to export that problem and leave those women and those families completely abandoned in a really awful situation, having to travel out of their country to have their health needs met. It doesn't address the issue of rape or incest, for instance, pregnancy as a result of rape or incest. So there's a number of issues that it doesn't address. Amnesty International's position is that women should have access to safe, lawful termination of pregnancy where there's a risk to their life or health, where there's a fatal fetal abnormality, or in cases of rape or incest. That's been the organisation's position since 2007.
Colm, thanks a million for coming in to us today. Colm O'Gorman there from Amnesty International. We'll be back with the news.
Moncrieff on News Talk 106 to 108.